Sarah Martinez adjusted the worn baseball cap lower over her eyes as she approached the massive concrete walls of Blackwater Correctional Facility. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison yard, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching her from behind barred windows. She had spent months preparing for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare someone for walking voluntarily into one of the most dangerous prisons in the country. At 42 years old, Admiral Sarah Martinez had dedicated her life to serving her country. She had commanded special operations across 3 continents, earned more medals than she could count, and led some of the most elite fighting forces in the world. But today, she wasn't Admiral Martinez. Today, she was Sarah Johnson, a small-time drug dealer caught with enough cocaine to earn her a 5-year sentence. The transformation had been remarkable. Gone were the crisp uniforms and polished boots. Instead, she wore faded jeans, a stained t-shirt, and scuffed sneakers. Her usually perfectly styled hair hung limp and unwashed around her face. Dark circles under her eyes made her look like someone who had been living on the streets for months. The makeup artist at the intelligence agency had done incredible work, making her look like a completely different person. This wasn't just any undercover operation. For the past 18 months, female prisoners at Blackwater had been disappearing without explanation. Official reports claimed they had been transferred to other facilities, but family members who tried to visit were told conflicting stories. Some were told their loved ones had been released early. Others were told they had been moved to maximum security wings that didn't allow visitors. The stories never matched, and too many women had simply vanished. The FBI had tried sending in agents before, but they had been discovered within days. Prison guards were smart about spotting law enforcement. They knew how to spot someone who had received formal training, someone who carried themselves with confidence, someone who knew how to handle dangerous situations. What they weren't expecting was someone who had been trained not just in law enforcement, but in deep cover operations behind enemy lines. Sarah had volunteered for this mission personally. When she learned about the missing women, many of whom were mothers separated from their children, something inside her had snapped. These weren't enemy combatants or terrorists. These were American citizens who deserved protection, even behind prison walls. The fact that someone was preying on them made her angrier than any battlefield she had ever faced. The preparation had been intense. For 3 months, she had lived in a safe house, learning to walk differently, talk differently, and think differently. She had studied the backgrounds of dozens of real prisoners, memorizing their stories and their mannerisms. She had learned about drug addiction, petty crime, and the kind of desperation that led people to make terrible choices. Most importantly, she had learned to suppress every instinct that made her a leader. As she approached the prison gates, Sarah forced herself to slouch. She shuffled her feet instead of marching with purpose. She kept her eyes down instead of scanning for threats. Every fiber of her being wanted to stand tall and face whatever was coming with confidence, but that would blow her cover immediately. Today, she had to be weak. Today, she had to be vulnerable. Today, she had to be exactly the kind of person that predators would target. The first checkpoint was routine. A bored-looking guard glanced at her paperwork and waved her through without really looking at her face. The second checkpoint was more thorough. They checked her identification against a computer system and asked her a few basic questions about her case. Sarah answered in the tired, defeated tone she had practiced hundreds of times. She was just another criminal being processed into the system. But it was the third checkpoint where things got interesting. As Sarah stood in line with 3 other new arrivals, she noticed the way the female guard was looking at them. It wasn't the professional assessment of someone doing their job. It was the calculating gaze of someone sizing up merchandise. The guard's eyes lingered on each woman, noting their age, their build, their apparent level of education. When her eyes met Sarah's, something cold passed between them. The guard's name tag read, Morrison, and she had the kind of hard face that came from years of working in places where kindness was seen as weakness. She was probably in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, and arms that looked like she could handle herself in a fight. But it was her eyes that bothered Sarah the most. They were completely empty of empathy. Morrison separated Sarah from the other new arrivals, claiming there was a problem with her paperwork. She led Sarah into a small, windowless room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. The walls were painted an institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it. A single metal table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by two uncomfortable chairs. The paperwork excuse was obviously fake. Morrison barely glanced at Sarah's files before setting them aside and studying Sarah herself with uncomfortable intensity. She walked slowly around Sarah, like a predator circling prey, making notes on a clipboard that Sarah couldn't see. The silence stretched on for several minutes, broken only by the sound of Morrison's pen scratching against paper. Finally, Morrison spoke. Her voice was flat and emotionless, as if she had given this speech many times before. She explained that Blackwater had very strict rules about contraband, and that new arrivals needed to be thoroughly searched before they could be admitted to the general population. She made it sound routine, but something about her tone suggested it was anything but. Sarah had expected this. Prison searches were standard procedure, and she had been prepared for the humiliation and discomfort that came with being treated like a criminal. What she hadn't expected was the way Morrison was looking at her, as if she were particularly interesting for reasons that had nothing to do with standard security procedures. Morrison called for backup, and two more guards entered the room. One was a younger woman named Peters who looked nervous and avoided eye contact. The other was an older man named Davis who had the kind of dead eyes that Sarah had seen in war zones. Neither of them spoke, but they positioned themselves at the door as if they were expecting trouble. The search began normally enough. Sarah was ordered to remove her shoes, her belt, and her jacket. Morrison checked each item carefully, running her hands along every seam and checking every pocket. She was thorough, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary for a prison intake. Sarah began to wonder if she had misread the situation. But then Morrison's demands became more invasive. She ordered Sarah to remove her shirt, then her pants, claiming she could see suspicious bulges in the fabric. Sarah complied, forcing herself to look embarrassed and intimidated rather than angry. She stood in the cold room in just her underwear, tried to look like a frightened drug dealer rather than a military officer who had been in far worse situations. Morrison's hands were rough and impersonal as she conducted the search, but Sarah could sense something else in her touch. There was a possessive quality to it, as if Morrison was claiming ownership rather than just checking for contraband. When Morrison's fingers lingered longer than necessary in certain areas, Sarah knew she was right about what was happening here. The real moment of truth came when Morrison ordered Sarah to remove her underwear. This went far beyond standard search procedures, and Sarah could see Peters shifting uncomfortably by the door. Even in maximum security prisons, strip searches were supposed to be visual only unless there was probable cause to believe someone was hiding something dangerous. Morrison had no such justification, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, letting some of her real anger show through her fake fear. It was exactly the kind of reaction Morrison was looking for. A woman who was truly intimidated would either comply immediately or break down crying. Someone with fight in them would hesitate, would show a flash of defiance before being forced to submit. Morrison smiled for the first time since Sarah had met her, and it was not a pleasant expression. What Morrison didn't know was that the woman standing before her had survived interrogations by enemy forces that would have broken most people. She had endured torture that would have left permanent scars, if not for the skill of military surgeons. She had faced down armed terrorists in situations where surrender meant death or worse. A corrupt prison guard trying to humiliate her was barely worth her attention. But Sarah couldn't let any of that show. Instead, she had to play the role of a victim, someone who could be controlled and manipulated and eventually made to disappear like all the others. It was perhaps the hardest acting job of her life, suppressing every instinct that had kept her alive through 2 decades of military service. As Morrison's demands became more degrading and more obviously illegal, Sarah noticed something important. Peters was taking notes. Not official intake notes, but detailed observations about Sarah's appearance, her reactions, her level of compliance. Davis was watching not Sarah, but the door, as if he was standing guard against interruption rather than preventing escape. This wasn't a random search. This was an evaluation. Morrison was determining whether Sarah would be suitable for whatever had happened to the other missing women. The realization sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but also gave her hope. If she could convince Morrison that she was the right type of victim, she might finally learn what had been happening to the missing prisoners. The search continued for another 20 minutes, with Morrison finding increasingly creative excuses to prolong and intensify the humiliation. Sarah endured it all with the kind of stoic patience that had served her well during survival training, but she made sure to show just enough resistance to seem realistic. She had to appear strong enough to be worth targeting, but not so strong that she would be considered a threat. When it was finally over, Morrison seemed satisfied with what she had observed. She allowed Sarah to get dressed, but there was something in her manner that suggested this was far from the end of their interaction. As Sarah pulled on her clothes with deliberately shaky hands, Morrison made notes on her clipboard that looked more like a shopping list than a security report. Before leaving the room, Morrison leaned close to Sarah and spoke in a voice so quiet that the other guards couldn't hear. She told Sarah that she had made quite an impression and that she should expect special attention during her stay at Blackwater. The words were delivered like a threat, but Sarah understood them as confirmation that her cover had worked. She was now on Morrison's radar for all the wrong reasons. As Sarah was finally led toward the general population, she caught a glimpse of Morrison speaking quietly with Davis. The conversation was brief, but Sarah could read body language well enough to know they were discussing her. Plans were being made, and she was at the center of them. Walking through the corridors of Blackwater, Sarah forced herself to look around with the wide eyes of someone seeing a maximum security prison for the first time. In reality, she was conducting a tactical assessment. She noted the locations of security cameras, the positions of guards, the layout of the corridors, and the sight lines between different sections of the facility. Information that might seem irrelevant now could become crucial later. The general population area was exactly what she had expected from her research. Concrete walls, metal bars, and the constant sound of voices echoing off hard surfaces. The smell was a mixture of disinfectant, unwashed bodies, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or desperation. It hung in the air like smoke. Her cell assignment was in Block C, which according to her research was where most of the women who had disappeared had been housed. The coincidence was too obvious to be accidental. Morrison was already setting things in motion, placing Sarah exactly where she needed to be to become the next victim. Her cellmate was a woman named Rosa, who had been in Blackwater for 6 months on a drug-dealing conviction. Rosa was in her 30s, with tired eyes and the kind of nervous energy that came from being constantly alert to danger. She welcomed Sarah with cautious politeness, but Sarah could see she was sizing her up just as carefully as Morrison had. As they talked through the evening, Sarah learned that Rosa had been friends with 2 of the women who had disappeared. Both had been taken from Block C in the middle of the night, supposedly for transfer to other facilities. Rosa had never heard from either of them again, despite promises that they would be able to write letters once they were settled in their new locations. Rosa's description of how the women had been selected matched what Sarah was beginning to suspect. They were all relatively young, relatively attractive, and all had shown signs of fighting spirit that needed to be broken down. They were also all women who had few visitors and family members who wouldn't cause too much trouble if they disappeared. That night, as Sarah lay on the narrow prison cot staring at the ceiling, she reviewed everything she had learned. Morrison was definitely involved in whatever was happening to the missing women. The strip search had been an evaluation disguised as standard procedure. Her placement in Block C was no accident, and based on Rosa's stories, she probably didn't have long before she would be selected for whatever fate had befallen the others. But Sarah had advantages that the other women hadn't possessed. She knew this was coming, she was trained for exactly this type of situation, and she had backup waiting outside the prison walls. Most importantly, she knew how to fight back when the time was right. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah Martinez began planning her next moves. Tomorrow, she would continue playing the role of Sarah Johnson, frightened drug dealer. But underneath that mask, a Navy SEAL admiral was preparing for battle. The next morning brought Sarah's first real test of her cover identity. Prison life moved according to rigid schedules, and new inmates were expected to learn the routines quickly or face consequences from both guards and other prisoners. Sarah had to balance appearing confused and overwhelmed while secretly observing everything around her for clues about the missing women. Breakfast was served in a massive cafeteria that could hold nearly 300 people. The noise was overwhelming. Hundreds of conversations, clattering metal trays, shouted orders from guards, and the constant underlying tension that came from putting dangerous people in close proximity. Sarah forced herself to look nervous as she moved through the food line, but her eyes were constantly moving, cataloging faces, noting relationships between prisoners, and identifying potential allies and threats. She sat with Rosa and two other women from Block C. Maria was serving time for armed robbery and had been at Blackwater for over a year. Jennifer was newer, having arrived just 3 weeks before Sarah, convicted of embezzlement. Both women seemed genuinely friendly, but Sarah could sense they were being careful about what they said around the newcomer. It was Jennifer who first mentioned the missing women directly. She spoke in the careful way that people used when discussing dangerous topics in dangerous places. She mentioned that she had expected to see more familiar faces from her intake group, and seemed confused about why certain women weren't around anymore. Maria quickly changed the subject, but not before shooting Jennifer a warning look that Sarah pretended not to notice. After breakfast, Sarah was assigned to work detail in the prison laundry. This turned out to be a stroke of luck, as the laundry processed clothing and bedding from throughout the facility. It gave her access to areas she wouldn't normally be able to reach, and, more importantly, it put her in contact with prisoners from different blocks who might have information about the missing women. The work was hard and monotonous, exactly the kind of mind-numbing labor designed to break down prisoners' spirits over time. Sarah spent hours sorting dirty laundry, loading massive washing machines, and folding endless piles of prison uniforms. But while her hands were busy, her mind was working overtime, processing conversations and observations that might prove crucial to her mission. It was during her second day in the laundry that Sarah met Carmen, a woman who had been at Blackwater for 3 years and seemed to know everything that happened within the prison walls. Carmen was in her 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She had been convicted of running a sophisticated fraud operation and still carried herself with the confidence of someone who had once controlled her own destiny. Carmen approached Sarah during their lunch break, striking up what seemed like casual conversation. But Sarah could tell she was being evaluated, just as she had been by Morrison and the other inmates. Carmen asked questions about Sarah's background, her family, her case, and her plans for when she got out. Sarah answered with a carefully constructed story she had memorized, but she could sense that Carmen wasn't entirely convinced. On the third day, Carmen made her move. She pulled Sarah aside during a quiet moment in the laundry and spoke in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. She told Sarah that she had noticed her asking subtle questions about women who weren't around anymore. She warned Sarah that such curiosity could be dangerous, but she also said something that made Sarah's heart race with excitement. Carmen revealed that she had been keeping her own records of the women who had disappeared. She had noticed patterns that the guards thought no one would see. She knew which guards were involved. She knew roughly when the disappearances happened, and she had theories about where the women were being taken. But most importantly, she suspected that the next selection was coming soon. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Gar Morrison, who seemed to have a sixth sense for appearing whenever something interesting was happening. She didn't say anything directly threatening, but her presence was enough to end Carmen's revelation and send both women back to their work. As Sarah folded prison uniforms with mechanical precision, she could feel Morrison's eyes on her back. That evening, back in her cell, Sarah found a way to continue the conversation with Carmen. Prison communication networks were remarkably sophisticated, and messages could be passed between cells through a combination of whispered conversations during movement between areas, notes hidden in common areas, and coded conversations during meal times. Carmen had been using these networks to track the disappearances, and she was willing to share what she knew with Sarah. According to Carmen's information, the missing women had all been taken on nights when certain guards were working specific shifts. Morrison was always involved, along with Davis and two other guards named Thompson and Williams. The women were removed from their cells between 2 and 4 in the morning when most of the prison was asleep and minimal staff was on duty. The official paperwork always claimed the women were being transferred to other facilities for various reasons: medical treatment, legal proceedings, family emergencies, or disciplinary issues. But Carmen had contacts throughout the prison system, and none of the women had ever arrived at their supposed destinations. They had simply vanished from the system entirely. Carmen's most disturbing revelation was that the selection process seemed to involve more than just the guards. Someone with access to detailed prisoner records was providing information about each woman's background, family situation, and likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. This suggested involvement from administrative staff or possibly people outside the prison entirely. Based on Carmen's timeline, Sarah calculated that she probably had less than a week before she would be selected. The realization was both terrifying and exciting. She was getting close to uncovering the truth, but she was also walking directly into extreme danger with no guarantee that her backup plan would work. Over the next few days, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in how she was being treated by the guards. Morrison continued to pay special attention to her, but now other guards were taking notice as well. Davis would stare at her during meal times. Thompson found excuses to be present whenever Sarah moved between different areas of the prison. Williams began asking her questions that seemed innocuous, but were clearly designed to gather information about her background and her level of compliance. Sarah also began to notice that she was being isolated from other prisoners. Work assignments that would have put her in contact with long-term inmates were changed at the last minute. Conversations with other prisoners were frequently interrupted by guards who claimed to need Sarah for various administrative tasks. Even Rosa, her cellmate, seemed to be pulling away, as if she had been warned to keep her distance. The isolation was clearly part of the selection process. By cutting Sarah off from potential allies and support networks, the guards were making her more vulnerable and easier to control when the time came to make their move. It was a sophisticated psychological operation designed to break down her defenses and leave her feeling helpless and alone. But Sarah had one advantage that her enemies didn't know about. She had been trained to operate in hostile territory with minimal support, and isolation was something she had learned to use as a weapon rather than a weakness. While the guards thought they were weakening her, she was actually using the time to conduct more detailed reconnaissance and prepare for what was coming. She memorized the guard schedules down to the minute. She identified every security camera in Block C and plotted their blind spots. She located emergency exits, weapon storage areas, and communication equipment. She studied the architectural plan she had memorized before entering the prison and began to understand how the building's layout could be used to her advantage. Most importantly, she began to understand the psychology of her enemies. Morrison was clearly the leader, but she relied heavily on the support of the others. Davis was brutal, but not particularly intelligent. Thompson was nervous and could probably be intimidated if necessary. Williams was smart, but seemed to be motivated primarily by money rather than ideology, which meant he might be turned under the right circumstances. On her sixth day at Blackwater, Sarah received confirmation that the selection process was nearly complete. During what was supposed to be a routine medical checkup, she was subjected to additional tests that went far beyond standard prison health care. Blood samples were taken, detailed physical measurements were recorded, and she was photographed from multiple angles for reasons that were never explained. The prison doctor conducting the examination was a nervous man named Dr. Peterson, who seemed deeply uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. He avoided eye contact with Sarah and conducted the examination with the mechanical efficiency of someone who was following orders he didn't agree with. When Sarah tried to ask questions about the unusual procedures, he mumbled vague explanations about updating medical records and standard protocols for new inmates. But Sarah noticed that Dr. Peterson was filling out forms that looked nothing like standard medical paperwork. The documents had letterheads she didn't recognize and contained sections for information that seemed more relevant to identifying physical characteristics than assessing health conditions. When she tried to get a better look at the forms, Dr. Peterson quickly covered them and told her the examination was complete. That evening, Carmen managed to pass Sarah a message warning her that the selection was imminent. According to Carmen's sources, the unusual medical examination was the final step before a woman was taken. Based on the pattern Carmen had observed, Sarah would probably be removed from her cell within the next 48 hours. The message also contained more specific information about what Carmen believed was happening to the missing women. She had pieced together fragments of overheard conversations, unusual supply deliveries to the prison, and suspicious vehicle movements in and out of the facility. Her theory was that the women were being sold to human trafficking organizations that specialized in providing victims who wouldn't be missed by law enforcement. According to Carmen's analysis, the operation was sophisticated and well-funded. The women weren't just being sold locally. They were being shipped to buyers in other states or possibly other countries. The prison was being used as a source of victims because it provided access to women who had already been separated from their families and support networks, making them ideal targets for traffickers. The revelation filled Sarah with a cold rage that she had to work hard to conceal. She had suspected something like this, but having it confirmed made the situation feel much more urgent. Somewhere out there, the women who had been taken from Blackwater were suffering in ways that Sarah didn't want to imagine. If she could stop this operation, she might be able to save not just future victims, but possibly some of the women who had already been taken. That night, Sarah lay awake planning her next moves. She had gathered enough information to understand the basic structure of the operation, but she still needed to identify everyone involved and gather evidence that could be used in court. Most importantly, she needed to find out where the women were being taken and whether any of them were still alive. But time was running out. Based on everything she had learned, she would probably be taken within the next day or two. Once that happened, she would be completely on her own, with no way to communicate with her backup team, and no guarantee that anyone would ever find her. As she listened to Rose's quiet breathing from the other bunk, Sarah began to finalize her plans. Tomorrow, she would trigger the emergency protocol that would alert her handlers that the operation was moving to its final phase. She would also begin implementing the contingency plans she had developed for surviving whatever came next. Admiral Sarah Martinez had faced impossible odds before, but never quite like this. Tomorrow, she would find out if 20 years of military training could prepare someone for being sold into slavery by corrupt prison guards who thought they were targeting a helpless drug dealer. The irony wasn't lost on her. They wanted a victim, and they had chosen one of the most dangerous people in the American military. When they realized their mistake, it would be far too late to change course. Sarah Martinez was about to show them exactly what happened when predators chose the wrong prey. The day Sarah had been dreading and preparing for arrived with deceptive normalcy. Morning routines proceeded exactly as they had for the past week. Breakfast at 6, work detail at 7:30, lunch at noon. But Sarah could sense the difference in the air. Guards who usually ignored her were paying closer attention. Morrison appeared in places she normally wouldn't be seen. Even some of the other prisoners seemed nervous, as if they could sense something was about to happen. During the lunch break, Carmen managed to slip Sarah a final message. It contained a hand-drawn map of the prison's lower levels, areas that most inmates never saw. According to Carmen's intelligence, the missing women were taken to a holding area in the basement before being moved out of the facility entirely. The map also showed possible escape routes and hiding places that might prove useful if Sarah's plans went wrong. Along with the map was a small piece of metal that had been carefully sharpened into a makeshift weapon. It wasn't much, but in the right hands it could be deadly. Carmen had obviously been planning for this moment for some time, and Sarah was touched by the older woman's courage in helping her. Carmen was risking her own safety to help someone she barely knew, simply because it was the right thing to do. The afternoon work shift in the laundry passed slowly, with Sarah forcing herself to maintain the routine while mentally reviewing every detail of her escape plans. She had identified 17 different contingencies, depending on how events unfolded. Some plans relied on overpowering her captors through surprise and superior training. Others involved more subtle approaches, using psychological manipulation to turn the guards against each other. All of them were dangerous, and none of them guaranteed success. At 4 o'clock, Sarah was called away from her work assignment for what was described as a meeting with a prison counselor. This was obviously a pretext. She had never been assigned a counselor, and the guard who came to collect her wasn't someone she recognized from the regular staff rotation. He was younger than the guard she had been dealing with, nervous, and kept checking his watch as if he was working on a tight schedule. Instead of taking her to the administrative offices where counseling sessions would normally be held, the guard led Sarah through a series of corridors she had never seen before. They passed through multiple security checkpoints, each one taking them deeper into areas of the prison that were off-limits to regular inmates. The walls here were older, made of stone instead of concrete, suggesting they were entering parts of the original building that had been constructed decades ago. Finally, they arrived at a heavy metal door marked only with a number, B7. The guard used a key card and a physical key to unlock it, then gestured for Sarah to enter. Beyond the door was a staircase leading down into darkness. Sarah had found the basement level that Carmen had marked on her map. The guard followed her down the stairs, his flashlight creating dancing shadows on the walls around them. The air was cooler here, and Sarah could hear the sound of machinery running somewhere in the distance. This was clearly a service level, used for heating, electrical systems, and other infrastructure that kept the prison running. It was also the perfect place to hold someone temporarily without being discovered by other staff members. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a corridor lined with small rooms that had obviously been converted from their original purpose. Some appeared to be storage areas, but others had been modified with locks on the outside and small windows in the doors. Sarah realized she was looking at improvised holding cells designed to keep prisoners isolated from the rest of the facility. The guard directed her into one of these rooms, a space about 8 feet by 10 feet with concrete walls and a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a metal cot with a thin mattress, a small sink, and a toilet that had seen better days. It was clean, but depressing, exactly the kind of place designed to break someone's spirit before worse things happened to them. As the guard prepared to lock her in, Sarah made her first move. She had been playing the role of a frightened, compliant prisoner for over a week, and the guard had no reason to expect any resistance from her. When she suddenly spun around and grabbed his wrist, his surprise was total. Before he could react, she had twisted his arm behind his back and relieved him of his keys, his radio, and the small pistol he carried in his shoulder holster. The guard started to shout for help, but Sarah's hand clamped over his mouth before he could make more than a muffled sound. She applied pressure to a nerve point in his neck that she had learned during hand-to-hand combat training, and he went limp immediately. He wasn't dead, just unconscious, but he would be out long enough for her to implement the next phase of her plan. Sarah quickly searched the guard's pockets and found additional information that confirmed her worst fears. He was carrying a folder with detailed photographs and personal information about her, along with what appeared to be shipping manifests and contact information for people outside the prison. The operation was much larger than she had suspected, involving buyers in multiple states and possibly international connections. But the most disturbing discovery was a medical report with her photograph attached. Someone had been conducting detailed analysis of her blood work, her physical condition, and her psychological profile. They weren't just selling women randomly. They were matching specific victims to specific buyers who had particular requirements. Sarah realized she had been selected not just because she fit the general profile, but because someone had specifically requested someone with her characteristics. Using the guard's radio, Sarah was able to listen to communications between different parts of the prison. She quickly learned that Morrison and the others were preparing to move her within the next few hours. A vehicle was scheduled to arrive at 11 p.m., and Sarah was supposed to be ready for transport by then. She had less than 6 hours to gather evidence, locate any other victims who might still be in the facility, and find a way to alert her backup team. But first, she needed to explore the basement level more thoroughly. Using the guard's keys and following Carmen's map, Sarah began systematically checking the other rooms in the corridor. Most were empty, but 3 contained evidence that made her stomach turn. Personal belongings that had clearly belonged to the missing women were stored in boxes, along with clothing, jewelry, and photographs. It was like looking at a collection of trophies from previous victims. In one room, Sarah found something that gave her hope. A journal hidden behind a loose stone in the wall, written by one of the missing women during her time in the holding cells. The entries described being held in the basement for several days before being moved to what the writer called the farm. The journal contained descriptions of other women who were being held there, details about the guards who were involved in the operation, and, most importantly, clues about the location where the victims were being taken. According to the journal, the farm was a compound located somewhere in rural Nevada, several hundred miles from the prison. The women were transported there in specially modified vehicles that looked like regular delivery trucks, but had hidden compartments for concealing people. Once at the farm, they were held until buyers could be found for them, then shipped to their final destinations. The journal also revealed that the operation had been running for at least 3 years, much longer than Sarah had suspected. Dozens of women had passed through the basement holding cells, and very few had ever been seen again. Those who had tried to escape or resist were used as examples to keep the others compliant. The writer of the journal clearly believed she was going to die, but she had continued documenting everything in the hope that someone would eventually find her record. As Sarah read the journal by flashlight, she heard footsteps on the stairs above her. Someone was coming, probably to check on the guard she had incapacitated. She quickly photographed the relevant pages with a small camera she had concealed in her shoe, then replaced the journal exactly where she had found it. She also took several pieces of physical evidence that could be used in court, including the shipping manifests and contact information she had taken from the guard. But as the footsteps grew closer, Sarah realized she had a choice to make. She could try to escape immediately, using the guard's keys and her knowledge of the prison layout to fight her way out of the facility. This would allow her to alert her backup team and potentially save other women from being victimized. But it would also mean abandoning any chance of infiltrating the larger operation and rescuing the women who had already been taken. Alternatively, she could allow herself to be transported to the farm, giving her a chance to gather evidence about the entire trafficking network and possibly rescue multiple victims at once. But this plan was extremely risky. If something went wrong, no one would know where to find her, and she might end up as just another missing woman. As the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah made her decision. She quickly hid the evidence she had gathered in a location where her backup team would eventually find it, then returned to the holding cell and arranged the unconscious guard to make it look like he had simply fallen asleep on duty. She wiped her fingerprints off the keys and the radio, then sat on the cot and waited. When Morrison arrived with 2 other guards to check on the situation, she found exactly what she expected to see: a frightened prisoner sitting quietly in her cell while a lazy guard dozed nearby. Morrison was clearly angry about the guard's lack of professionalism, but she had no reason to suspect that anything unusual had happened. The guard would wake up confused and embarrassed, but with no memory of being attacked. As Morrison prepared to leave, she informed Sarah that she would be moved to a different location later that evening. She made it sound routine, but Sarah could see the satisfaction in her eyes. Morrison believed she was about to complete another successful transaction, adding to her record of women who had simply disappeared without a trace. What Morrison didn't know was that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her criminal career. Instead of shipping off another helpless victim, she was about to put a highly trained military operative directly into the heart of the trafficking operation. Sarah Martinez was going to let them take her exactly where she wanted to go. But first, she had one more task to complete. Using a technique she had learned during survival training, Sarah created a nearly invisible mark on the wall of the holding cell that would identify her to any law enforcement officers who eventually searched the area. The mark contained coded information about the location of the evidence she had hidden and instructions for tracking the route to the farm. As evening approached, Sarah could hear increased activity in the basement. Vehicles were arriving, and she could hear multiple voices discussing logistics and timing. The operation was moving into its final phase, and soon she would be on her way to Nevada and whatever awaited her there. But Admiral Sarah Martinez was no longer playing defense. She had gathered enough information to begin planning her counterattack. Soon, the predators who had been hunting vulnerable women would discover that they had chosen the wrong prey. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Sarah intended to make sure that none of them would ever harm another innocent person again. At 11 p.m. sharp, Morrison and 3 guards Sarah hadn't seen before came to collect her from the holding cell. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before, but Sarah could sense an underlying tension that suggested not everything was going according to plan. One of the guards kept checking his phone, and Morrison seemed more irritated than usual. The transport began with Sarah being fitted with restraints that were much more sophisticated than standard prison equipment. The handcuffs were reinforced with steel cables, and her ankles were shackled with a short chain that would make running impossible. Over her prison uniform, they put a heavy jacket that appeared normal, but was actually designed to conceal the restraints underneath. As they led her through a service entrance she had never seen before, Sarah got her first look at the vehicle that would transport her to Nevada. It appeared to be a standard delivery truck with a well-known shipping company's logo on the side, but the modifications were immediately obvious to someone with her training. The windows were tinted far darker than regulations allowed, and the rear compartment had been completely rebuilt for transporting people rather than packages. Inside the truck, Sarah discovered she wouldn't be traveling alone. 2 other women were already secured in specially built seats that looked like airline seats, but were designed to prevent any movement. Both women appeared to be drugged, their eyes unfocused, and their movements sluggish. Sarah recognized one of them from the prison, a woman named Lisa who had been serving time for check fraud and had been reported as transferred to another facility just 3 days ago. The other woman was younger, probably in her 20s, and appeared to have been severely beaten. Her face was swollen and bruised, and she had the hollow look of someone who had given up hope entirely. When Sarah tried to make eye contact with her, the woman just stared at the floor with the empty expression of someone whose spirit had been completely broken. The guards who loaded Sarah into the truck were different from the prison staff she had been dealing with. They were professional, well-armed, and moved with the kind of coordination that suggested military or law enforcement training. These weren't corrupt prison guards looking to make easy money. These were experienced criminals who specialized in human trafficking operations. As the truck began its journey, Sarah was able to observe the operation's security measures through careful listening and observation. The guards maintained constant radio communication with someone they called Control, providing regular updates on their location and estimated arrival time. They also followed specific protocols for avoiding law enforcement, taking routes that avoided way stations and checkpoints where trucks might be inspected. But Sarah also noticed weaknesses in their security. The guards were confident, perhaps overconfident, and they clearly weren't expecting any resistance from their prisoners. They talked freely about previous shipments, discussing women by numbers rather than names, and complaining about buyers who were too particular about their requirements. The conversation made Sarah's skin crawl, but it also provided valuable intelligence about the scope of the operation. From their discussions, Sarah learned that the farm was actually a large compound that processed dozens of women every month. Some were sold domestically to buyers who wanted slaves for various purposes. Others were shipped internationally to countries where human trafficking was easier to hide and harder to prosecute. The operation was sophisticated enough to have connections with corrupt officials, fake documentation networks, and transportation systems that could move people across borders without detection. The truck stopped twice during the 12-hour journey. Both times the truck stops where the guards could refuel and change drivers without attracting attention. During these stops, Sarah was able to gather additional information by listening to phone conversations and observing the guard behavior. She learned that they were expected at the farm by noon, and that several buyers would be arriving that afternoon to inspect the new arrivals. But the most important information came from a phone conversation she overheard during the second stop. One of the guards was speaking to someone about a special order, a buyer who had specifically requested someone with Sarah's characteristics and background. The conversation confirmed Sarah's earlier suspicion that she hadn't been selected randomly. Someone had specifically wanted a woman who appeared to be a tough, experienced criminal who could be broken down and used as an example to intimidate other victims. As the truck approached its destination, Sarah began to implement the escape plan she had been developing during the journey. The handcuffs they had used were high quality, but they weren't designed to hold someone with her specialized training. Using techniques she had learned during prisoner of war training, she had been gradually working the restraints loose throughout the trip. By the time they reached Nevada, she could free herself whenever she chose to. But Sarah had decided not to escape during the transport. Instead, she wanted to reach the farm and gather intelligence about the entire operation before making her move. She needed to know how many victims were being held there, who was in charge of the operation, and how to contact her backup team when the time was right. The farm turned out to be a sprawling compound in the middle of the Nevada desert, far from any populated areas where screams might be heard or suspicious activity might be noticed. The main building was a large warehouse that had been converted into dormitories and processing areas. Surrounding it were several smaller buildings that appeared to serve various functions: offices, storage, and what looked like punishment facilities for victims who didn't cooperate. The security was impressive and troubling. High fences topped with razor wire surrounded the entire compound, and Sarah could see guards with automatic weapons patrolling the perimeter. There were guard towers at strategic locations, and the entire facility was monitored by an extensive camera system. Getting out wouldn't be easy, even for someone with her training. As Sarah was unloaded from the truck, she got her first look at the man who appeared to be in charge of the farm. He was tall and thin, with the kind of cold eyes she had seen in war criminals and terrorists. He introduced himself to the guards as Mr. Kane, and it was immediately clear that everyone at the facility was afraid of him. Even the armed guards deferred to his authority without question. Kane examined each of the three women with the detached interest of someone inspecting livestock. He made notes on a clipboard, asked questions about their backgrounds, and discussed their potential value with the guards who had transported them. When he got to Sarah, he spent more time studying her than he had with the others, and she could see him making mental calculations about how much money she might be worth. Sarah was processed through the facility's intake system, which was disturbingly thorough and professional. She was photographed from multiple angles, measured and weighed, and subjected to medical examinations that were obviously designed to assess her value as merchandise rather than her health. The entire process was documented on forms that would clearly be provided to potential buyers. During the intake process, Sarah was able to observe the facility's layout and security measures more carefully. The main warehouse contained roughly 40 women in various stages of the trafficking process. Some appeared to be new arrivals like herself, still showing signs of fight and resistance. Others had clearly been there longer and showed the psychological damage that came from extended captivity and abuse. The women were housed in dormitory-style rooms that were kept locked at all times. Each room contained 8 to 10 beds, with basic sanitary facilities and minimal privacy. The conditions were better than Sarah had expected. The traffickers obviously wanted to keep their merchandise in good condition, but the psychological atmosphere was oppressive. The women she saw moved with the careful, fearful manner of people who had learned that any sign of resistance would be severely punished. Sarah was assigned to a room with 7 other women, ranging in age from 19 to 35. As she was introduced to her new living situation, she began gathering intelligence about how the facility operated and who might be willing to help with an escape attempt. Most of the women were too frightened or broken to be useful, but she identified 2 who still showed signs of fighting spirit. One was a woman named Jennifer, who had been a police officer before being framed for drug dealing and sent to the same prison where Sarah had been held. Jennifer had been at the farm for 6 weeks and had been gathering her own intelligence about escape possibilities. She was smart, observant, and still angry enough to be dangerous to their captors. The other was Maria, a former Army medic who had been convicted of stealing medical supplies to treat veterans who couldn't afford health care. She had only been at the farm for 10 days, but had already begun treating injuries that other women had suffered at the hands of guards and buyers. She was also the only person in the facility who might recognize Sarah's military training if she wasn't careful to conceal it. That first night, as Sarah lay on the narrow cot, listening to the quiet sounds of women crying themselves to sleep, she began planning the most complex rescue operation of her career. She needed to free not just herself, but potentially 40 other women, many of whom were too traumatized to be reliable in a crisis situation. She needed to do it in a way that would capture the people running the operation rather than just driving them underground to continue their activities elsewhere. But most importantly, she needed to do it before the buyers arrived the next afternoon. According to conversations she had overheard, several women were scheduled to be sold and removed from the facility within the next few days. Once they were dispersed to their final destinations, many of them would never be found again. As she listened to the guards changing shifts outside her dormitory, Sarah began implementing the emergency communication protocol she had memorized before entering the prison. Using a method that involved creating specific patterns in the facility's electrical usage, she could send coded messages to monitoring stations that her backup team was watching. The messages would alert them to her location and provide instructions for coordinating a rescue operation. But Sarah also knew that help was still at least 24 hours away, assuming everything went perfectly. In the meantime, she was on her own in the middle of the desert, surrounded by armed guards, and responsible for protecting 40 terrified women who had no idea that help was finally coming. Admiral Sarah Martinez had faced impossible odds before, but never quite like this. Tomorrow, she would have to find a way to turn a group of traumatized trafficking victims into an effective resistance force capable of taking on professional criminals with military-grade weapons. And she would have to do it while maintaining her cover as just another broken prisoner, because if Kane suspected what she really was, everyone in the facility would be dead before sunrise. Dawn came early in the Nevada desert, and with it came the sound of vehicles approaching the compound. Sarah had spent the night awake, observing guard patterns and developing detailed escape plans, but the arrival of multiple cars meant that the buyers were arriving ahead of schedule. Her timeline had just been cut dramatically short. From her dormitory window, Sarah could see well-dressed men emerging from expensive vehicles. These weren't the rough criminals she had expected, but business people who looked like they could be attending a corporate meeting rather than shopping for human slaves. The sight made her stomach turn, but it also gave her important information about the operation's scope and sophistication. Through whispered conversations with Jennifer and Maria, Sarah learned that buyer visits followed a predictable pattern. The women would be assembled in the main warehouse area, where buyers could inspect them and ask questions about their backgrounds, skills, and health conditions. Those who were selected would be prepared for immediate transport, often leaving the facility within hours of being chosen. But today's visit was different. According to Maria, who had been watching Kane's behavior carefully, something had the facility's leadership on edge. Phone calls were more frequent, and urgent security patrols had been doubled, and several guards who normally work day shifts had been called in early. Something was making the traffickers nervous, and Sarah suspected it might be related to her disappearance from the prison. Sarah realized she had reached the point of no return. If she waited any longer, some of the women in the facility would be sold and taken away before she could save them. Her backup team wasn't in position yet, but she couldn't wait for perfect conditions that might never come. She would have to trigger the rescue operation immediately, using only the resources available inside the compound. During the morning meal, Sarah managed to have detailed conversations with Jennifer and Maria without attracting attention from the guards. She carefully revealed just enough of her background to convince them that she had military training without giving away the full extent of her qualifications. Both women were intelligent enough to understand what she was suggesting, and desperate enough to be willing to take enormous risks for even a small chance at freedom. The plan Sarah outlined was necessarily simple, since they had no time for complex preparations, and most of the potential participants were too traumatized to handle sophisticated operations. The three of them would wait until the buyer presentations began, when most of the guards would be focused on managing the inspection process. They would then create a distraction that would allow them to access the facility's weapons and communication equipment. Jennifer's police training made her the natural choice for handling the security systems once they gained access to the main office. Maria's medical background would be crucial for treating any injuries that occurred during the escape attempt. Sarah would handle the direct confrontation with the guards, using techniques that the other women couldn't be expected to know. But the plan required something that seemed almost impossible: convincing nearly 40 terrified, traumatized women to participate in a violent confrontation with their heavily armed captors. Many of the women had been at the facility long enough to be completely broken psychologically. Others were too physically weak from malnutrition and abuse to be effective in combat situations. Convincing them to fight back instead of hiding would require careful psychological preparation. Sarah began implementing this preparation during the morning work detail, when the women were assigned various cleaning and maintenance tasks around the facility. Moving from group to group, she began planting the seeds of resistance by reminding the women of what they had been before their capture. She talked to Jennifer about her police training, to Maria about her military service, to others about their children or their dreams or anything that might rekindle their sense of identity and purpose. The psychological work was delicate and dangerous. If any of the guards overheard conversations about resistance, the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. But Sarah had been trained in psychological operations, and she knew how to motivate people to take action even in desperate circumstances. By the time the buyer presentations began that afternoon, she had identified 12 women who might be willing to fight back if given the opportunity. The presentations themselves were a horrifying display of human degradation. The women were assembled in the main warehouse and forced to stand while buyers walked among them, examining them like livestock and asking questions about their backgrounds and capabilities. Kane acted as a sales representative, highlighting each woman's particular attributes and negotiating prices with the calm professionalism of someone selling used cars. Sarah was one of the women selected for closer inspection by multiple buyers. Her apparent combination of toughness and vulnerability made her particularly valuable to buyers who specialized in breaking strong women down into compliant slaves. As she endured the humiliation of being examined and discussed like property, She was also gathering final intelligence about the facility's security measures and the number of guards present. But the inspection process also provided the opportunity she had been waiting for. When Kane led a group of buyers to a secure office to finalize paperwork for their purchases, Sarah gave the signal that began the escape attempt. The plan started with what appeared to be a fight between two women over access to bathroom facilities, a common occurrence that wouldn't immediately alert the guards to anything unusual. As guards moved to break up the fake fight, Sarah and Jennifer moved toward the armory where the facility's weapons were stored. Maria created a medical emergency by pretending to have a seizure, drawing additional guards away from their posts. The diversions worked perfectly, giving Sarah the few minutes she needed to reach the armory and acquire the weapons that would give them a fighting chance. But as Sarah broke into the weapons storage area, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Someone had spotted her movement, and the entire compound was now on high alert. Guards were running toward her position with automatic weapons, and she could hear Kane shouting orders over the facility's intercom system. The element of surprise was gone, and they were now committed to a direct confrontation with overwhelming odds. Sarah emerged from the armory armed with an assault rifle and extra magazines, but she was immediately under fire from guards positioned throughout the warehouse. Her military training took over completely as she moved through the facility, using cover and tactical movement to stay ahead of her pursuers while working her way toward the main office, where Kane was trying to coordinate the response to the uprising. Behind her, she could hear Jennifer and Maria implementing their parts of the plan. Jennifer had reached the security office and was systematically disabling the cameras and communication systems that the guards relied on for coordination. Maria was moving through the dormitories, helping to evacuate women who were too frightened to move on their own, and providing medical assistance to anyone who had been injured in the initial chaos. But the most encouraging sound was the voice of women who had decided to fight back. Some of them had armed themselves with improvised weapons from a kitchen and maintenance areas. Others were creating additional diversions by setting fires and damaging equipment throughout the facility. The guards, who were accustomed to dealing with cowed, compliant victims, were completely unprepared for coordinated resistance from women who had decided they had nothing left to lose. The battle for control of the compound lasted nearly 2 hours, with Sarah systematically working her way through the facility's defenses while coordinating the resistance efforts of the other women through hand signals and shouted instructions. Her military training gave her enormous advantages in direct combat, but the courage and determination of the women she was fighting alongside made the difference between success and failure. Kane made his final stand in the main office, surrounded by his most loyal guards and trying desperately to contact outside assistance. But Jennifer had done her job well, cutting all communications and disabling the vehicles that might have been used to escape or bring in reinforcements. When Sarah finally reached the office, Kane found himself facing someone who was clearly far more than she had appeared to be. The revelation of Sarah's true identity came as a complete shock to Kane and his surviving associates. They had believed they were dealing with a broken drug dealer, someone who could be controlled and intimidated like all their previous victims. Instead, they found themselves facing a highly trained military officer who had been gathering intelligence about their operation for weeks and was now systematically destroying everything they had built. The final confrontation was brief and decisive. Kane tried to use the remaining women as human shields, threatening to kill them unless Sarah allowed him to escape. But Sarah had dealt with terrorists and war criminals who used similar tactics, and she knew how to neutralize threats without endangering civilians. Within minutes, Kane and his guard were disarmed and secured, and the immediate danger to the women was over. As sirens wailed in the distance, announcing the arrival of federal law enforcement agents who had been coordinating with Sarah's backup team, the rescued women emerged from the compound into the desert sunlight. Many of them were crying, not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming realization that their nightmare was finally over. They were free, and the people who had stolen their lives were in custody. Jennifer and Maria helped Sarah coordinate with the arriving FBI agents, providing detailed information about the facility's layout and the evidence that had been gathered during the rescue operation. The compound contained detailed records of the trafficking operation, including information about buyers' financial accounts and other facilities that were part of the same network. But for Sarah Martinez, the most important moment came when she was finally able to contact her commanding officers and report that the mission had been successful. 18 women had been rescued from the facility, and preliminary investigations suggested that the evidence gathered would lead to the arrest of dozens of people involved in the trafficking network. More importantly, the operation had been shut down permanently, ensuring that no more women would suffer the fate that had been planned for all of them. As Sarah watched the rescued women being loaded into ambulances and federal vehicles that would take them to safety and medical care, she reflected on what the mission had taught her about courage and resilience. The women who had fought alongside her weren't trained soldiers or law enforcement officers. They were ordinary people who had found extraordinary strength when they needed it most. Admiral Sarah Martinez had begun this mission as a solo undercover operation designed to gather intelligence about missing prisoners. She ended it as the leader of a resistance movement that had not only rescued dozens of women from slavery, but had also struck a major blow against one of the most sophisticated human trafficking operations law enforcement had ever encountered. The guards who had demanded a strip search at Blackwater Correctional Facility had made a crucial error in judgment. They had seen what they expected to see, a vulnerable woman who could be easily controlled and exploited. They never realized that beneath the disguise was one of the most dangerous people in the American military, someone who had dedicated her life to protecting others and who would stop at nothing to ensure that justice was served. As the last of the rescued women disappeared into the vehicles that would take them home to their families, Sarah Martinez allowed herself a rare smile. The mission was complete, and the predators had learned too late exactly what happened when they chose the wrong prey.